Hello and welcome to this skating lesson. I'm Dave Leese, and today I'm thrilled to welcome Louise Radnofsky from the Wall Street Journal. Louise, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So I think this is interesting. You are one of the main figure skate journalists who covers a variety of Olympic sports. I actually heard that you skate yourself. Is this true?
It is true.
Okay. Your boots on the ground. I love it. Okay. Well,
Blades on the ground.
blades on the ground.
Yes, I like the expression.
Blades on the ground. Good point. All right. Well, I wanted to ask you about some of the reporting that you've been doing. I know that you've reported about Brendan Kerry, and this is a really interesting case for a number of reasons about SafeSport. And I just kind of wanted to ask you if you could provide some background before we discuss it about, how you, became aware of this case as much as you can say, and, what you think is important about it.
Yeah, so I've reported on SafeSport since before the center metaphorically opened its doors. I think I did my first story in August 2016 when they were still trying to figure out how they were going to fund this thing. And I've reported on SafeSport cases over the years. I've also reported on a lot of abuse in gymnastics in particular, because I started covering gymnastics in 2015. So you can sort of see the timeline there. I think this might be the first time I've actually reported on a SafeSport case in depth involving figure skating, which is, I guess, somewhat surprising because there's certainly, a lot there that's unfolded over the last few years. But in all honesty, what drew my attention to this case is what Gracie described happening to her in her memoir. And when I reported on that, and SafeSport pledged a thorough review of the case, which is not a particularly ordinary statement for them to make. They normally don't comment on specific cases ever. And when they said they were going to take a thorough review of this one, I thought that was very interesting. When we got to May, we did see some of the things happening as a result of that pledge, maybe connected to the book or not. And then from May, I really wanted to understand what exactly had happened, because by the Gracie timeline, there was a report that was made in October 2017, and there was a person who was added to the centralized database in May of 2024. That's almost 7 years. 7 years that actually spans the entire lifespan of SafeSport, which I thought was very interesting. And what this case shows is actually various iterations of the center, but that's also a very long timeline.
Yeah, I had first heard about that case. A friend called me who was interviewed as a witness years ago. That was at a party in question at a hotel after a skating show, and I just thought it was, interesting. I've always had this sinking feeling that maybe I've thought about with the justice in Nassar is that, and I'm wondering if from your reporting you could, tell me if I'm wrong, but in the case of the gymnastics, one of the reasons that I've always had a sinking feeling is that because there were so many famous victims, that this case got really settled more quickly than other cases have. And once Gracie went public, this case all of a sudden got settled, and the Delilah Sappenfeld case got settled in short order when these cases were being held up for years. Do you have any knowledge of how come SafeSport is now seeming to be, finally concluding cases that have been, in the air, in the ether for so long?
Yeah, well, what SafeSport told me is that they were rolling out a number of changes this year. And one of the changes that they say they made as part of their process to overhaul how they were doing things was in December 2023, they attempted to identify cases that had been open for more than 2 years. And they ended up finding 127 cases, of which I think it's pretty likely that this was one. And so they are now making progress with those 127 cases. They are through just over half of them in terms of getting them to a resolution. The numbers in the story, and they've changed quite a lot actually even in the last few weeks, but the numbers we were able to put in the story were the most recent ones. 68 had been resolved, and then the remainder were roughly evenly divided between being in legal reviews, and the investigative report was complete, and the investigation was still ongoing. So at that point would have been 2.5 years longer. So there appears to be a push that SafeSport says is unconnected to Gracie's book, but people also did see Gracie's book certainly as shedding at least a lot of light on the situation and possibly affecting the way that the case was wrapped up as well, depending on who you ask.
I mean, it doesn't surprise me that they would say it is not connected, but I mean, I think the timeline is the timeline, whether we can say it impacted it or not.
I mean, the flip side of that is that you have a case where the stakes are incredibly high in every safe sport case, but the PR stakes were especially high in this one when you had a very high profile claimant who was openly struggling at the time that the allegations were made. You had allegations that there were multiple victims. You had allegations that the victims were minors. And this was all starting to unfold in October 2017, which was right at the moment where everybody could see what was happening to USA Gymnastics, and they continued to see that for the next year. And the stakes for an NGB or for SafeSport, which was then really new in being able to get a case right. Every motivation should have been, to most people's eyes, to do this quickly. There were a number of reasons why that wasn't possible.
I'm also curious, in your safe sport cases, have you ever heard, failure to report is said to be a very important thing. Have you seen any actual safe sport cases where someone has gotten in trouble for failure to report? Because I'm wondering, in many of these cases, there are whispers that other people knew. We don't see that safe sport has really gone down those rabbit holes. I mean, I'm curious if you've seen this in other sports.
I mean, one of the things you know about SafeSport is that there's not a lot of transparency around cases, and there are plenty of reasons why people think that that's a good thing, including confidentiality. But the flip side of it is that you really don't know a lot about how SafeSport is working. And you could argue that people might have more confidence in it if they did know more. You could also argue that people would have even less confidence in it if they thought the SafeSport was going around and talking about the cases that it was handling. So the short answer is we don't know. I don't think anyone really knows. What is striking in this case is that I reported it pretty exhaustively. And there are very clear signs that US figure skating reported when they were supposed to in October 2017, as they were required to do under the code that was then in effect. There's no written record by the looks of it as to whether they reported to the center, which at the time had no real formal processes, but there appear to be signs that they did and were told this was out of jurisdiction. And most importantly, they say that they did. They say that on the record. And so there are also written records to show that they did go to law enforcement in October 2017. That was not a situation here where we're wondering, did this happen?
Yeah.
As a reason why the timeline then became so long. Now, there's a lot of other stuff that happened right after that, but there wasn't an obvious failure to report here, either to law enforcement because there was an allegation that there was a minor victim, or to the center.
I just want to be clear, I wasn't implying that about US figure skating. I'm curious about the burden of proof in this case. My understanding from reading about the case and the findings was that they weren't able, and you could correct me with the terminology, but that they couldn't prove Gracie's case beyond a reasonable doubt, but that there was another victim that whose case was proved beyond a reasonable doubt. Is that
so? SafeSport uses a standard of the preponderance of evidence, which means that it's more likely than not that something happened. And they couldn't find evidence in the case of Gracie, in the case of Claimant 2, about what happened in the hotel room and after the ice show in Santa Barbara. But what they found some other findings relating to her, but they were relatively minor, I think she would say. In Claimant 1's case, they did find an indication of sexual misconduct involving a minor, and that's what you see in the CDD now. And that's a lower standard than the criminal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. What Brendan Kerry said, told the investigator, is that he didn't know that she was underage. So the facts are not necessarily in question about what happened either. There's an argument that he's making, but the central facts of the case involving Claimant 1 are not particularly complex. Which is also striking, right? SafeSport talks a lot about how hard it is to resolve a case of emotional or physical, especially emotional abuse, because so much of what happens is contextual. There's a lot about here that is context dependent by the strict reading of the code. It was a relatively straightforward case to deal with. And I say relatively because obviously, again, no SafeSport case is straightforward.
No, I'm curious how this intersects now with law enforcement, because my understanding is that in Claimant 1's case, during the appeal process, when Brendan Kerry did say that he didn't know about the law, that because of what he admitted, if he were to enter the state of California, that could, present a problem where he could become a registered sex offender, but that he's not currently one. How does that work in terms of that system? If someone is found to be, preponderance of the evidence, more guilty than not, but law enforcement isn't involved at this time, how does this all intersect? Because I think that people have a lot of questions. The number one question I always get is, why didn't someone go to the police? There's always a lot of other factors that comes in, and it's not a perfect system. So I'm wondering if you could kind of talk through some of, those issues.
Yeah. SafeSport's jurisdiction is limited, which is part of the story too, but it's also jurisdiction that is only extending as far as sport, and often sport within the United States Olympic movement too. So SafeSport does not interact with the criminal process in that sense. It polices, for want of a better word, sport, and its decisions only affect somebody in sport, which of course to many people who are involved in the system, respondents and claimants alike, is almost everything. What happens to you in your career at elite sport almost matters more. But this doesn't really have any bearing on how the state of California views this. Although what is significant, perhaps, is that the law was also pretty clear in the state of California about the age of consent, and it's 18 in California. And so again, the facts that SafeSport was operating off of were fairly straightforward in addition to the code. Riverside Police Department were contacted by Mitch Moyer. There's a record of that call that took place, but they told him that because they told him that Gracie would have to make the report herself, which she was, for a variety of reasons, reluctant to do. I think there's an interesting question too about what people think might have been different if she had. I think there's not really a lot of sign that anything, her assumption, and she details in this book, is, what are the police going to do? What evidence is there? Who's going to be able to make a decision about what really happened, which is exactly what ended up happening with SafeSport. They looked at the more likely than not standard and said there's not enough evidence here to be able to say what happened. The criminal standard is higher than the SafeSport standard. It's extremely unlikely that, you could see a police department in Santa Barbara with people who do not live in Santa Barbara, one of whom may or may not be in Riverside at whatever timeline we're talking about here, then taking action. But what did happen is that Riverside Police Department received what is effectively a tip, and decided that unless somebody came to them directly, one of the alleged victims in Riverside, that was the end of it. No one has come forward, is basically what they just recorded, and then they kind of considered the matter recorded.
Yeah, I think the other aspect is that there's been a huge fallout in Australia for that. And I know that that's not necessarily in your reporting, though you may be somewhat aware of. It's important to know that Brendan Kerry is an Australian. He is now back in Australia, but they have chosen to take action based on this report, which I don't believe they were required to. I don't know that there's these bodies, OSIC, SafeSport, whatever the institute is in Australia, that they're all reciprocal. So what's your understanding of that?
There's a really interesting issue here about an international sport like figure skating, and not just international in terms of people meeting up at international competitions and how you govern those, but in addition, what you do if you have situations where you regularly have people who are not US figure skating members, or who are not American figure skaters, let's put it that way, who are in the United States training with US coaches alongside top US figure skaters. Maybe they're coaching. What kind of jurisdiction do you want SafeSport to have over those people going forward, and how would you go about getting that? Because right now SafeSport is pretty clear that it doesn't have jurisdiction over non-members of an NGB, and that it's not allowed to share information with an equivalent body overseas. They've asked Congress to change that for them, but right now they think they can only share information with local law enforcement. So they would say that they were prohibited from sharing information with whatever the equivalent body in Australia was. The Australian Ice Skating Association maintained very clearly in May they were unaware of the investigation until they saw the information pop up in the CDD.
And that has been very big news in Australia, as Brendan was the flag bearer at the Olympic Games for Australia, and his mother has also really been involved in Australian figure skating. So I know that there's a huge fallout there. It's interesting when you're talking about jurisdiction, because I know that you haven't reported on Nikolaj Sorensen. However, it was, announced that he, has been banned for a minimum of 6 years by the OSIC in Canada for an event, an incident that took place in Connecticut, right? So that is in the United States. This event was ruled, preponderance of the evidence more likely than not to have occurred enough that they have banned him for 6 years. It's interesting that they don't have jurisdiction. Is it because he's not an actual... Do you understand the jurisdiction issues? He's not a member of US figure skating, although I imagine Brendan had to be a member of US figure skating. Nikolaj used to train with the coach whose house the incident, took part in. So I'm wondering, what your understanding of the jurisdiction is in that case.
You do have to be a member of US figure skating. What appears to have happened over the timeline of the Brendan Kerry case is that he did become a member in order to coach at the ice house. And at some point after that, somebody noticed that he had become a member of US figure skating. There was also a change around 2019 where SafeSport started putting in a process of basically putting an allegation on hold if it came in about somebody who was not a member at the time. In case they became a member later, then you could open it immediately. But that's sort of one of the evolutions around the jurisdiction issue. The core part of it hasn't really changed. If somebody doesn't become a member, then there is a jurisdiction. But there are ways that people have discussed you could extend jurisdiction. You could require people to become members in order to coach, which is what happened at the Ice House, or potentially even to train at a rink. I think some rinks apparently do this. I don't know. Mine doesn't, as far as I know, and I don't know if yours does, but you might, for liability reasons alone, want to make sure that everybody who's training there is a US figure skating member. And they get Skating Magazine. However many times a year that's coming. There's sorts of incidental benefits, but yeah, there are reasons.
A coffee coaster, yes. But I wanted to ask you because Diana Davis and Gleb Smolkin were also members of US figure skating, and became that as is Eteri Tuberitsa, and I was wondering if that was curious to you that they became members of US figure skating.
I think there are probably a bunch of different reasons why you would become a member of US figure skating, and I didn't know that or how long they'd been members for, although feel like in order to even do learn to skate as a very tiny child now, you may end up finding yourself enrolled in US figure skating. But as you know, you have to renew it every year. What US figure skating actually had in the case of Brendan Kerry is for the 2019 to 2020 year, not only was he a member of US figure skating, he'd taken SafeSport training and he'd passed a background check that their contractor had done. And so he was very much compliant for the purposes of coaching as well as just a member. But what you do in terms of a competition, for example, like Skate America that's hosted in the United States, whether you feel like you might have jurisdiction over that because you're the national governing body and you're hosting the event, is a really interesting question. And I'm not sure that people have definitively agreed on what SafeSport's jurisdiction might be going forward, but that's what it seems to be right now. And they have plenty of cases coming their way already. That's an issue they would raise over and over again. They don't have the resources to move fast as much as they would like with the cases they're getting.
Is there any indication that they could be getting more resources in the future, or is there any information about that?
They have told Congress. So as you probably know, the center gets its funding from the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee, $20 million a year, but that funding is mandated by Congress in a federal law. And so that was in part designed to address concerns that if the USOPC was funding the US Center for Safe Sport, how independent could it really be? So Dries Colon, the CEO of Safe Sport, has asked Congress to mandate an additional $10 million. I think potentially the USOPC could also just offer that additional $10 million. But when we asked leadership there, they said this was the first they'd heard of it. So we'll continue to look into that one.
Yeah, because we have heard that they have been underfunded for a long time, and it doesn't seem like cases have been slowing down. Certainly, it seems like they have had quite a lot of work.
The numbers have shifted over time, but if you think about that first year, they had one investigator, and they got almost 300 reports coming in as soon as they stood up, because you had some historical ones too, and historical cases are also particularly difficult to investigate in and of themselves. So one investigator, 300 cases is a pretty large caseload. And then over time that has changed. There have been additions to staff, there have been changes to process, but the numbers are still pretty scary when you look at the number of reports that come in, but of that, the subset of cases that are created versus the number of people who are working on them.
Yeah, I'm curious about what you know about the arbitration process. Obviously, as it relates to figure skating, there were a couple of early cases, Richard Callahan, where the decisions were either lessened through the arbitration process or overturned in some cases. And I'm wondering if you've seen that that's changing at all. I know that Brendan Kerry's case went to arbitration and that it was affirmed, the decision. I know that Delilah Sappenfeld had time. She had 10 business days to appeal her finding by SafeSport, and that she didn't. I'm wondering what you're seeing in the appeals process.
There was a pretty big, I hesitate to use the word win because nobody wins in a SafeSport case, but I think for SafeSport, there was a moment of vindication when the Alberto Salazar case actually ended up getting upheld in arbitration. That was a turning point. And in the case of Alberto Salazar too, it really almost heightened the profile of SafeSport because there have been allegations against him involving other issues that had nothing to do with abuse. But in the end, what led to his banning was the abuse question. And so that was a moment for them. A figure skating decision that is upheld does appear to be different from perhaps the way these things have gone in the past, but it's hard to tell because you just don't have the data to see the full span of cases.
Mhm. And there is other reporting that just came out that the USFS lost its CEO. Tracy Merrick is no longer the CEO of US Figure Skating. Phil Hirsch did point out that that this did take place the week of Skate America. I'm wondering what you know about this, and how precedented this is, for an NGB to have a CEO, for a very short amount of time. I'm reminded of, obviously in USA Gymnastics, they went through several CEOs in a short amount of time.
That's actually, it's an interesting point about USA Gymnastics because they really did, although, the current CEO has actually been in place for a remarkably long time. And I don't think anybody thought that was a likely outcome in her case. I don't think anyone necessarily felt like it was very likely in 2019 that USA Gymnastics would still be the national governing body of the sport. But they came through bankruptcy and they now exist in a way that just seems remarkable. It's sort of almost a question with all of this reporting. You can look at a system, you can want to burn the system to the ground sometimes. People frequently tell me that they do because they're so frustrated with it. But there's also a question about what your alternative system is going to look like and whether you want to start it, whether you could, let alone whether you would want to start again from scratch, or whether you are to some degree forced to work within the parameters of what you have. If the Center for SafeSport is going to be the means by which you're going to be addressing sexual abuse in the Olympic movement in the United States, what would you want to do differently? How would things have to change in order to make people feel like the system is working better? And maybe the system is working better now, but you still have this issue of 7-year-old cases that are still being resolved now that only deepens the mistrust. And so you've got a difficult cycle to break here. And it's a tough job for the CEO as well.
Yeah, I'm wondering, in the case of USA Gymnastics, it does seem like they have turned around in a relatively short amount of time, considering that, the articles about US figure skating and the money dwindling and the ratings dwindling and the success is what it has. It seems like it's had, a longer period of struggle. Whereas USA Gymnastics had a very high profile struggle and that they seem to have rebounded, although a lot of that could be due to Simone Biles and her recent success and kind of the brands being associated with that. I'm interested about how many of these NGBs have just long-term financial issues.
What people always tell me about NGBs is that they're very different. And I think about USA Gymnastics and US Figure Skating quite similarly because they both represent the marquee sports for their respective Olympic Games. But you have smaller NGBs sort of go down the scale. You might have a USA Fencing, you might have USA USA Nordic is a subset of a smaller winter sports NGB, but you have all kinds of different structures of NGB. In some ways, that's actually why SafeSport was stood up in the first place. You had some NGBs saying that they were unable to handle these cases. What you now have is this ongoing tension, very real between the center and the NGBs, where the NGBs want to be able to take back more cases because they don't feel like the center is handling them properly. And the center points out fairly openly and pointedly that the reason the center exists in the first place is because NGBs like USA Gymnastics were not being seen to be handling their own allegations correctly in-house, or that there was a perception that they weren't handling them. Although I think you'd find few people who could feel very comfortable with how USA Gymnastics handled every aspect of the Nassar allegations starting in 2015.
Yeah, I will say that there are some long-term cases I know in gymnastics that have had, more reporting than others. Scott Reed has reported about the Anna Lee case. She was a judge at the Olympic trials this summer. So I'm just curious what kind of jurisdiction SafeSport has. Are there rules about if someone is under investigation, can they still participate as an official? What kind of are the legal ramifications as someone's under investigation?
SafeSport has the ability to impose temporary measures, including in cases involving minors. The overwhelming thing that I hear when reporting SafeSport cases, and from all directions, is that everybody wants to see the process move faster. That is, as true of respondents as it is of claimants. And Brendan Kerry pointed out in his main statement in May on everything that was happening that he hadn't heard anything about his case, he said, for more than 3 years, almost 3 years in the case of SafeSport, which is a timeline that does sort of match up with documents and other things that I've seen as well. Things just went very quiet in 2021. An investigator retired. Claimant 1 sent emails, including one on the eve of the Winter Olympics, to say, the Winter Olympics is about to start, what's going on, and then heard nothing, and then emailed a year later and a year later. So you had a very active participant in that process as well, and it still took as long as it did. But everybody seems to agree that you're going to have more and more problems when things aren't being resolved quickly, and that raises issues. Can somebody continue to judge? Is it fair to tell them they cannot continue to judge for a case that, how long is this going to go on for? It's clearly tough on absolutely everybody in different ways.
If someone chooses to leave the sport, are they still under SafeSport jurisdiction? I know there are cases, where obviously in John Coughlin, when he took his life, he was, that case was closed by SafeSport, and they didn't continue the investigation. Although there may have been things that they could have found, they ruled that it wasn't no longer an active threat. What would be if someone chose to retire from coaching? Would they still be under jurisdiction, or is that kind of?
The process has changed, and so I want to be careful. The best people to explain this would be people at SafeSport. You should invite them on. I'm sure they'd, welcome the chance to be able to talk about the process changes that they've implemented. But my understanding would be that you could put a case on hold if somebody is out of the movement, but it would reopen again if they were to enter the movement. And I believe that by the movement, they don't just mean the NGB that you happen to be a member of. I think, I'm not sure that there's a lot of NGB hopping going on, but there clearly is the potential for it to happen. It's clearly something that people are mindful of and want to continue to bear in mind. So the hold process that has emerged in the last few years might be intended to address that in the case of somebody who retired, at least. And yes, the Coughlin case raised questions. People wanted some answers, and the SafeSport jurisdiction was not necessarily where they were going to find them, but people understandably did want, but again, coming from all sides.
As the Olympic movement ramps up, I have to ask, what are you hearing about Russia? Obviously, the ISU recently ruled that they are still postponing the decision on Russia, though they recently had a council meeting where it was discussed. How many governing bodies are moving or capitulating across the board about whether to allow Russians as neutral athletes?
I remember tracking this really closely in the run-up to Paris, and you had to go international federation by international federation because of the way that the IOC set that out. That hasn't changed. There are fewer international federations that I should really check in with where they are all at on the Winter Olympics. But even if decisions have not been made right now, you can look at the very shrinking timeline to see that this would have to be very, very quick to change if you were going to see people skating in February of 2026, because you've got a season right now that will determine so much about February, the 25 to 26 season. It's looking tough. And that is actually what the US OPC chief executive said too when we asked her about this. She did not see the win, and she, sees where other NGBs and other National Olympic Committees are on this. They are not necessarily indicating that anything has changed as far as the original concerns. And the IOC's original concerns about Russia were not quite the same throughout the entire process. They became a concern that the Russian Olympic Committee had, I believe, sort of illegally annexed parts of Ukraine and usurped the authority of another National Olympic Committee, which as far as the IOC is concerned is the cardinal sin. But her point was that hasn't changed and the war hasn't changed. And we once asked her, is it the war or the doping? And she said, yes. So you kind of have a bunch of different factors that might be pointing in different ways for different people, but you're not seeing a lot of push. What you are, of course, seeing is former ROC skaters or former Russian skaters returning to the sport in other ways for other countries. And we certainly saw secret Russians, as my colleagues wrote about them in the Summer Olympics. And I think it looks very, very likely you'll be seeing a lot of them. I think you might have done quite a bit of reporting about some of them, but we'll probably see some of your favorite figures coming again.
I look forward to it. Louise Radnofsky, thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.